Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. I'm coming to you from Spokane, Washington, and wow, have we had a meltdown here. We are located about 300 miles east of Seattle, and an atmospheric river came through. We got a ton of rain, lots of wind, and boy did the snow melt. If you saw my last video, you know this whole area was just covered in snow. Now, what about this week's video? If you're new to gardening or you're interested in branching out to growing a few different types of crops, I thought it would be fun to talk this week about cool season crops. I'll explain which crops those are, I'll give you some growing tips on them, and also point out a few potential problems you might encounter and how to deal with them. So let's get started. So what are cool season crops? They are vegetable crops that really like the cool weather. You typically will plant them either in early spring or late in the garden season to grow during the cool fall months. They will tolerate a light frost. Now, certain types of cool season crops do not like that hot weather that happens at the peak of summer, and they will set seed and die. But the interesting thing is that certain crops, especially cabbage family crops and beet family crops, will grow through the entire season just fine. But if I don't give them that early start in the spring, usually about 3 weeks before our last average frost date, they will not be as productive. So that early start is the key. Which vegetable crops are cool season crops? Fava beans, beets, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, kale, kohlrabi, leeks, onions, pak choi, parsnips, peas, potatoes, radishes, rutabagas, shallots, spinach, Swiss chard, and turnips. Garlic is also considered a cool season crop because it's planted in the fall and harvested the following summer. You can plant them in the spring to harvest later this growing season, but you won't get as large a harvest. I wanted to show you two helpful resources that are on my website, susansinthegarden.com. The first one is Grow Vegetables. This is a very special section that I put together just for you. It's totally free. And so if you click on that link in the menu, you'll notice that it goes to this page, and there's some basic information at the start, and then if you go down to this chart, you'll see all of the different types of vegetable crops that I have included in this guide. And you'll also notice this column here says whether something is a cool season crop or a warm season crop. So here we have fava beans, beets, broccoli, and so on. So click on any link that is a crop you're interested in. So I'm on fava beans here. And each one has a specific guide to growing whatever the crop is. I've got some little known information in here, whether you would plant seeds or seedlings, when you would plant them, how long the seeds take to germinate, the depth to sow them, how much to space the plants apart, how to grow them, when to harvest them, and how to cook and preserve them. And then I also include some videos about growing these crops. So be sure to check that out. The other item on my website that I wanted to show you is under the Guides menu, and it says Seed Starting, When to Plant Vegetables, All Zones. This way I can cover all of your regions. So just go to the crop you're interested in growing, and it will tell you whether you should start it indoors or sow it directly out in the garden and the time frame. Soil thermometers are an inexpensive way to know how cold or warm the soil is. A temperature of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit is good for cool season crops. Oh, and don't be alarmed by the temperature in this photo. That was the reading of my compost pile last summer. Don't work with the soil when it's too wet. Most seed packets will say, plant when the soil can be worked. But what in the world does that mean? Simply put, it means the soil should be fairly dry and crumbly. Here's how to tell. Grab a handful of soil and squeeze it. If water oozed out of it and you just created a mud pie, it's too soon. But if it's just a little moist, and when you poke your finger into it, it gently breaks apart, that is perfect. I have to share my big goof with you. Many years ago, I learned my lesson the hard way. I jumped the gun while the soil was still quite wet and started working with the soil and planting things. I ended up with a garden full of dirt clods, which is not good for a vegetable garden. It completely changed the texture of the soil and took a couple of years to recover from that. Ugh. First and foremost, always read the back of the seed packet for any special instructions for whatever it is you're going to be growing. There is a wealth of information on there, especially planting depth, spacing, and so on. What I'm going to do now is group the various cool season crops together by their plant family, because what typically happens is they have the same needs and the same potential insect problems that I want to give you a heads up about. So let's get started. Let's start with the beet family, which includes beets, spinach, and Swiss chard. For each of these, you want to direct sow the seeds into the garden. The potential insect problem you might have is with leaf miners. The adult is a fly. It lays eggs on the leaves. The maggots hatch, tunnel through the leaves for a period of time, then they drop down into the soil to start the whole process all over again. The solutions for that would be to plant them under some type of row cover, whether it's floating row cover or agricultural insect netting. I have used both, and I've included a link to my comparison of them, which I did in a video not too long ago. The other thing you need to know is that the seeds for beets and Swiss chard are actually clusters of seeds. The great news is you don't have to separate them. But you want to be sure to space your beet plants about 4 inches apart and your chard plants about 6 to 8 inches apart. So once the seeds have germinated and the seedlings are about 3 inches tall, that's when you would want to thin them to those spacings. That way they have enough room to grow. Now let's look at cabbage family crops, which are also known as brassicas. These include broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, kale, kohlrabi, mustard, radishes, rutabagas, and turnips. Out of those crops, you can start all but the rutabagas and turnips indoors. All of them can be planted after the danger of really hard frosts have passed. And again, I like about 3 weeks before our last frost. I start broccoli seeds indoors about 10 weeks before the last spring frost. Unfortunately, cabbage family crops are very susceptible to insects, such as aphids, cabbage worms, and slugs. The solution for aphids and cabbage worms is to cover the planting immediately with floating row cover or agricultural insect netting. That way it acts as a physical barrier to keep the cabbage moth and aphids away from the plants. With slugs, you can use slug bait and you really want to choose organic slug bait because the non-organic version is toxic to kids and pets. That's not good. And you just sprinkle it on the soil. You can see that we've created some copper rings, and what we did is we bought some Corey's copper snail and slug tape and applied it to some 1.5-inch tall drain pipe rings and put it around the base of the plants. The thing is that copper reacts electrically with the skin of slugs, and they want nothing to do with it, so they will not climb up into your plants, which is awesome. Be sure to space your plants for all of these crops according to the packet directions. Now let's look at the carrot family, and the two vegetable crops that are members of it are carrots and parsnips. You want to direct sow the seeds out in your garden as soon as the soil can be worked, and now you know what that means. The reason for this is they do not like their roots to be disturbed, so if you were to plant them indoors and then later transplant them out in the garden, that can impact how their roots grow, and of course the roots are what we're growing to harvest. If you have carrot rust fly in your area, after you have planted your seeds, immediately erect a vertical barrier around the planting. The reason for this is because the adult is a fly, and it can't fly any higher than the tops of the foliage. If you erect a barrier that is 18 to 24 inches tall, for example, they can't get to your plants. What an easy solution. You do need to know that carrot and parsnip seeds are slow to germinate. So you just have to be patient with that. But once all the seedlings are about 3 inches tall, you want to space the seedlings apart by 3 inches. That will give the roots enough room to grow. And you want to just toss the seedlings that you pulled up while you were thinning them because, again, they don't like their roots to be disturbed. So if you replant them, chances are the roots won't grow correctly. How about the legume family? Fava beans and peas are cool season members of that family. Bush beans and pole beans are definitely legumes, but they are not cool season crops. They need to be planted after the danger of frost has passed. But with fava beans and peas, you can direct sow them either as soon as the soil can be worked, or you can start the peas indoors ahead of time. And something that I really like to do is plant mine in rain gutters. And I know this is going to sound a little weird if you haven't seen my videos on it, but I've got all sorts of them, and I'll put a link in the video description. You might think it's weird to include the nightshade family because that plant family includes tomatoes, eggplants, tomatillos, and peppers. And those are all definitely warm season crops. But it also includes potatoes, and potatoes are a cool season crop. You plant seed potatoes about 4 weeks before the last spring frost in either beds or containers. The potential insect problem you might have is the Colorado potato beetle, and the easiest way to manage them is by monitoring the plants regularly and hand picking the beetles or larvae off if you see them. Let's talk about the onion family. The most commonly grown vegetable crops in this family are garlic, leeks, onions, and shallots. And as I mentioned earlier, you typically will plant garlic in the fall and harvest them the following summer. But with the other crops, you can sow them directly in the garden as soon as the soil can be worked, or you can start them indoors ahead of time and transplant them in early spring. When it comes to growing onions, you can plant them from seeds, sets, which are those little bulbs that you see in garden centers, or from plant starts. Now, the last plant family for cool season crops is the sunflower family, believe it or not. Lettuce is actually a member of the sunflower family. Isn't that weird? You can direct sow the seeds outdoors as soon as the soil can be worked, or you can start some indoors about 3 weeks early. As far as potential problems, one might be critters. So birds or rabbits might want to nibble on your little seedlings, which is annoying. And in that case, I would recommend putting netting or some type of row cover or barrier around them so they can't get to the plants. The other thought was that slugs might be an issue. And again, you can use an organic slug bait such as Sluggo to keep the slugs at bay. I hope you've picked up some new gardening tips for growing cool season crops. But remember to check the description that goes with this video on my YouTube channel, because I've added in some links to blog posts about this topic and also some videos. Remember that you're welcome to email me with your questions. My email address is susan@susansinthegarden.com. Thanks so much for watching today, everybody. Happy gardening.